Well, GT7 1.32 is here, of course the April update, a more modest one with 4 vehicles, no circuit, a slight revision to Fuji Speedway and a couple of other smaller things here and there. We have probably more notably for sport mode fans and live competition fans, the Olympic qualification section, which has been added as well. We have some new scapes for the photographers among us, some quite nice looking scapes, I will say. And we also have, of course, the usual catch-all of various other bug fixes and improvements, which they always write, and pretty much any developer writes that kind of stuff. So on that point, if you have noticed anything weird, a glitch maybe, a car that's suddenly become really bad after this update, of course, drop it down in the comments. That's always fun to see. But in terms of the physics, I want to talk about that a bit more in a second, because I think the physics may have affected a couple of the cars in this patch, or at least I've noticed it more than I believe they would have, say, 2 or 3 updates ago, because over the past couple of updates there were some revisions to aero, to downforce, to the way cars react to curbs, to grip, that kind of stuff, and I think I've noted it more here, really, with a couple of these cars. Now, speaking of the vehicles, of course, it's the meat of the update, so let's talk about it first. We have most notably the Jag XJ220. I mean, spoiler alert, I will talk about, of course, all 4 of these vehicles over the coming days on the channel in their own videos. But kicking off with the Jag, it's very good. It's definitely the standout for me. It's a very, very good 90s supercar. It's not quite as nimble as something like a Porsche 959. It's not as sharp as a Ferrari F40, but it's more than powerful enough. It has very long gearing, which is something that you might want to change, or at least give it way more power to compensate for that, but it's very pleasant to drive. It feels heavier and bigger than it is. I mean, it is a big car, but at 1,370 kilos, it's not actually that heavy at all. Just don't go into it expecting like a McLaren P1, because it isn't. Of course, it's a 90s car, and the XJ220, despite having some motorsport success, probably most notably at Le Mans, where its victory was technically taken away afterward, it's a bit more of a Bugatti EB110 kind of supercar, a little bit more refined, a little bit more on the classy end of the spectrum, whereas something like a Porsche 959 or a Ferrari F40 or a McLaren, they swing more so toward the motorsport end with little to no thought for comfort, class. The Jag and the Bugatti definitely more so did have that. I guess you could put the Chazetta in that camp as well with a bit more class. Now, fantastic car, I would say. All 4 of these vehicles are going to set you back a hair under 3.1 million, with the Jag being 615,000, so not that bad actually. Probably not as expensive as many of us would have thought. Technically then cheaper than it used to be when it was last in Gran Turismo in 6, when it was like 750 grand, so quite a big difference there, which is nice to see. And incidentally, the Jag, probably most notably of all, has kind of TWR visual parts. It's not actually TWR stuff. For example, the spotlights in the front bumper are not as large as they should be. It looks it in this video, but that's because a player created this livery. If you take the livery off though, you'll see what I mean. The rear wing also doesn't completely match up, and I think that's probably for licensing reasons. They don't want to get too close to the TWR. It kind of reminds me of what we could do with the SLR McLaren back in Gran Turismo 6, where you could make it look like a 722 GT, but not quite. I mean, I guess that technically is still the case now with the modifications in this game. Of course, I had to fit those to it. I mean, if nothing else, just for the visuals, and I may well do a special projects build in future for the TWR, to the surprise of absolutely no one. Next up, though, we have the Mercedes. The Mercedes is interesting in terms of how it compares to the existing AMG GT3s. I want to talk about the physics on this one in just a second, as I alluded to earlier on. It compares to the normal car, interestingly. Power is no change, 614. It's lighter though, at 1,285 kilos, and interestingly, it's actually taller and longer than the outgoing car. Not notably, you know, it's not like a Mini next to a Cadillac, but it is technically a bigger vehicle, mostly because of the extended aero, I believe. The rear diffuser in particular definitely looks bigger than the outgoing car. It sits at 736 points, of course, in Group 3, and the pricing is a little bit higher than some of the other Group 3s at 480,000 instead of 450, so not a huge difference. One of those cars that I think those who do really love this one are really happy to see it in the game, and for many of us it's probably more so like, oh yeah, that's cool, that's in the game now. For me, I definitely fall more so into that camp. I don't see myself using this one that much because I didn't really use the existing Mercedes that much. It's not one of my preferred teams as much as I love Mercedes as a whole. But in terms of the physics, the thing that I've noticed with this car and with the Super Formulas, and I'd be interested to know if anyone else has found this or feels the same way, I think some of the physics changes, downforce changes, seem to have made some of these race cars in particular a little bit more skittish at low speeds. Like at really low end speeds exiting a corner, they seem to kind of spin up their rear wheels a little bit earlier than they typically would. Like you haven't given it quite as much throttle as you would think you'd need to spin out the back end or to spin up the tyres, and yet it does seem a little bit more prone to that. Maybe it's just me, but it seems more notable than before, and in terms of it being much more notable, that brings me to the Super Formulas. Because both of these, of course, are basically exactly the same. They do sound a bit different, but in terms of spec, in terms of performance, they're identical. That's the whole point. You have Honda, you have Toyota, they're a million each, and you can choose which one you want, or just buy both if you want to, of course. The SF23 Dallara models. How do these ones compare? Well, again, I will get into it more so in their own review. I will probably feature both of them in the same review because, you know, there's no point in making two videos. This is very interesting though, how they do compare, because I actually think this might be an improvement. See, the point level is lower on this car. They're not technically faster, at least on paper, because they have 625 horsepower, so not a massive change there. But the interesting part is the power arrives 1000 RPM lower. And even more interestingly, the torque is improved, and the peak torque arrives 1500 RPM lower. So in other words, you're hitting the torque point and the peak power point more than 1000 RPM quicker through each gear, which means that you're getting that power and you're getting that torque earlier, which is never a bad thing. The point level is down though, compared to the outgoing cars, which are like 952, 953, this is 950. Not a massive difference, but at that level, any difference is significant, and incidentally, these are also a little bit heavier, 10 kilos more, at 670. In terms of how they actually drive, you can definitely feel the difference in aero, that's for sure, but again, I am curious how much of that is because it's a different model, and how much, like the Mercedes, is because of the physics changes. Because I found that these cars are actually a lot more slippery than I would have expected with either of these Super Formula cars. If you just give it a bit too much throttle, they seem to lose grip and suddenly snap oversteer a bit sooner and a bit easier than I would have thought they would, despite still having a pretty hefty amount of downforce and being on sports tyres, or soft tyres I should say, racing softs. So I find it curious, maybe that's just a me thing, so I would be curious to know in the comments if anyone else feels that way, or if it's something that feels normal to you, or no real change. And I think ultimately my thoughts on this update are that it's not necessarily the patch that's going to bring back everyone who was bored with the game or who wasn't playing it much anymore. I already know of people who have said that they probably won't be coming back this month for this one. I wouldn't blame anyone for that, XJ220 notwithstanding. It is a pleasant enough update with 4 pretty good cars, it has to be said. None of them out of the 4 are bad, that's for sure. A couple of nice updates and 1 fresh, new, iconic supercar. In terms of the rest of the stuff, it's more subtle things, subtle changes, and probably most notably for anyone who enjoys the online stuff, the inclusion of the Olympic registration, which is a pretty big deal if you do plan to take your online gameplay of Gran Turismo to the next level. If you are good enough to reach those kind of levels, then you're probably super excited about that. So ultimately, that's it for my thoughts on the update as a whole. Of course, like I said, any additional thoughts or things that you think I missed, drop it down in the comments, and naturally stick around over the next few days, because I will be doing reviews for the cars individually as well. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.